Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, we will be looking at Social Darwinism in American Thought by Richard Hofstadter. This book was published originally in 1944. This is the 8th printing from April 1964. And it gives a bit of a history of social Darwinism in America and overseas, but with a special focus, obviously, of social Darwinism in America. I do appreciate the fact that he talks a little bit about William James in here. Toward the end of the book and toward the end of the episode, I'm going to look at that section. He covers a couple of different people. Hofstadter talks about Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner. And as on all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections here and provide a little bit of feedback to what I've read. I want to start off here in the beginning, in the introduction, where he talks about Darwinian conservatism. He says, quote, "Darwinism was used to buttress the conservative outlook in two ways. The most popular catchwords of Darwinism, struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, when applied to the life of man in society, suggested that nature would provide that the best competitors in a competitive situation would win, and that this process would lead to continuing improvement. In itself, this was not a new idea, as economists could have pointed out, but it did give the force of a natural law to the idea of competitive struggle. Secondly, the idea of development over aeons brought new force to another familiar idea in conservative political theory, the conception that all sound development must be slow and unhurried. Society could be envisaged as an organism, or as an entity something like an organism, which could change only at the glacial pace at which new species are produced in nature. One might, like William Graham Sumner, take a pessimistic view of the import of Darwinism and conclude that Darwinism could serve only to cause men to face up to the inherent hardship of the battle of life. Or one might, like Herbert Spencer, promise that, whatever the immediate hardships for a large portion of mankind, evolution meant progress, and thus assured that the whole process of life was tending towards some very remote but altogether glorious consummation. But in either case, the conclusions to which Darwinism was at first put were conservative conclusions. They suggested that all attempts to reform social processes were efforts to remedy the irremediable, that they interfered with the wisdom of nature, that they could lead only to degeneration. As a phase in the history of conservative thought, social Darwinism deserves remark, insofar as it defended the status quo and gave strength to attacks on reformers and on almost all efforts at the conscious and directed change of society. Social Darwinism was certainly one of the leading strains in American conservative thought for more than a generation. But it lacked many of the signal characteristics of conservatism as it is usually found. A conservatism that appealed more to the secularist than the pious mentality. It was a conservatism almost without religion, a body of belief whose chief conclusion was that the positive functions of the state should be kept to the barest minimum. It was almost anarchical, and it was devoid of that center of reverence and authority which the state provides in many conservative systems. Finally, and perhaps most important, it was a conservatism that tried to dispense with sentimental or emotional ties." End quote. So there you have a sort of basic idea here. Social Darwinism was actually a fairly important part of conservatism in the late 19th century. It was not the sort of, like nowadays, nobody really considers themselves a social Darwinist. It's quote unquote debunked. But evolutionary theory, evolutionary psychology is definitely making a comeback in conservative circles. And some echoes of social Darwinism might prove accurate. Maybe they didn't understand entirely what we know about genetics now. There was an interesting period post-Darwin, pre-genetics, when there was a lot of wild speculation about what the implications of Darwinism really were. And there was definitely, as the author says, some of the first implications of Darwinism were interpreted in a socially conservative way. Now, obviously the word conservative is, let's say, flexible and means different things to different people. And some people would say that the secular quality of social Darwinism means it inherently is not conservative. People think there must be a religious element. Others might say that the minimalist state, the anarchist quality of it, that's not really conservative. That's really an odd offshoot of liberalism. And certainly, as I've said before, a conservatism built on evolutionary theory, a secular conservatism, isn't going to look the same as religious conservatism. There's no reason that it would. It's going to have its own distinct quality. And maybe the word conservative can only be stretched so far to cover so much ground, or is only so useful as a semantic football. And maybe other words and more terminology like social Darwinism or evolutionary politics or whatever it may be. Other words and phrases need to come into use, but there's also the enduring problem of terminology like social Darwinism being scorned in the leading thought institutions to whatever the terminology one might come up with, sociobiology or whatever it might be. It can be tarred and then it can be repudiated. And then people have to come up with a new word or not be able to accurately speak about what they're trying to say as words get banned. So let's move to the next section. He talks about Herbert Spencer, who was an English sociologist, who was an early adopter of Darwinism. Darwin himself was English. And Herbert Spencer wrote The Study of Sociology. It was, I think, his major work, but he's got a couple important books that he wrote, both political and sociological, and he was a major figure, and then he sort of got left behind as I think genetics started to make some of his ideas less likely, but also the wave of progressivism at the end of the 19th century adopted Darwinism in its own way, but didn't associate with social Darwinism because of that competitive, anarchistic aspect to it. The progressivism was much more like, let's all do this together. Communitarian / communist. And they didn't appreciate social Darwinism. So in that wave of progressivism, people like Herbert Spencer got their names scratched from history in a way. Anyway, he says, quote, "In the Study of Sociology, first published in the United States in 1872 to 73 in serial form by the Popular Science Monthly and incorporated in the International Scientific Series, Spencer outlined his conception of the practical value of social science. Written to show the desirability of a naturalistic social science, and to defend sociology from the criticisms of theologians and indeterminists, the book had a notable influence on the rise of sociology in the United States. Spencer was animated by the desire to foster a science of society that would puncture the illusions of legislative reformers, who, he believed, generally operated on the assumption that social causes and effects are simple and easily calculable, and that projects to relieve distress and remedy ills will always have the anticipated effect. A science of sociology, by teaching men to think of social causation scientifically, would awaken them to the enormous complexity of the social organism and put an end to hasty legislative panaceas. Fortified by the Darwinian conception of gradual modification over long stretches of time, Spencer ridiculed schemes for quick social transformation. The great task of sociology, as Spencer envisioned it, is to chart the normal course of social evolution, to show how it will be affected by any given policy, and to condemn all types of behavior that interfere with it. Social science is a practical instrument in a negative sense. Its purpose is not to guide the conscious control of societal evolution, but rather to show that such control is an absolute impossibility, and that the best that organized knowledge can do is to teach men to submit more readily to the dynamic factors in progress. Spencer referred to the function of a true theory of society as a lubricant, but not a motive power in progress. It can grease the wheels and prevent friction, but cannot keep the engine moving. There cannot be more good done, he said, than that of letting social progress go on unhindered. Yet an immensity of mischief may be done in the way of disturbing and distorting and repressing by policies carried out in pursuit of erroneous conceptions. Any adequate theory of society, Spencer concluded, will recognize the general truths of biology and will refrain from violating the selection principle by the artificial preservation of those least able to take care of themselves. End quote. So there you see some of Herbert Spencer, the study of sociology. He's talking about social science and the need for a social science to document the patterns and the actual shape of the evolution of society and of humans. In the same way that we study evolution biologically of humans and other animals, to take that same sort of observational approach to understand how societies evolve, to document their evolution, but not to try to interfere with the evolution of society, in the idea that we know better than what nature will produce. Nature, by the very laws of nature, reward success and punish failure. Systems, people, ideas that are successful at maintaining themselves and reproducing themselves will be successful, and they will therefore pass on their own qualities as the idea or society or institution perseveres over time, influences other institutions, and expands and grows in power otherwise. So he really says don't mess with things, just let it go the way it is and track it. And the more people try to fiddle with it, the more they impede it. It can't have any other impact but deviate from, by its natural course, it goes straight for the bullseye of maximizing survival capability. That's what evolution does. And any deviation from that would be disruptive, according to Herbert Spencer. He talks some more about Spencer here. He says, quote, "Conservatism and Spencer's philosophy walked hand in hand. The doctrine of selection and the biological apology for laissez-faire, preached in Spencer's formal sociological writings and in a series of shorter essays, satisfied the desire of the select for a scientific rationale. Spencer's plea for absolute freedom of individual enterprise was a large philosophical statement of the constitutional ban upon interference with liberty and property without due process of law. Spencer was advancing within a cosmic framework the same general political philosophy, which under the Supreme Court's exegesis of the 14th Amendment served so brilliantly to turn back the tide of state reform. It was this convergence of Spencer's philosophy with the court's interpretation of due process which finally inspired Mr. Justice Holmes, himself an admirer of Spencer, to protest that the 14th Amendment does not enact Mr. Herbert Spencer's social statics. Social views of Spencer's popularizers were likewise conservative. Humans took time from his promotion of science to attack the 8-hour strikers in 1872. Labor, he urged in characteristic Spencerian vein, must accept the spirit of civilization, which is pacific, constructive, controlled by reason and slowly ameliorating and progressive. Coercive and violent measures which aim at great and sudden advantages are sure to prove illusory. He suggested that, if people were taught the elements of political economy and social science in the course of their education, such mistakes might be avoided. Humans attacked the newly founded American Social Science Association for devoting itself to unscientific reform measures instead of a strict and passionless study of society from a scientific point of view. Until the laws of social behavior are known, he declared, reform is blind. The association might do better to recognize a sphere of natural, self-adjusting activity, with which government intervention usually wreaks havoc. There was precious little scope for melioristic activities in the outlook of one who believed with Yeomans that science shows that we are born well or born badly, and that whoever is ushered into existence at the bottom of the scale can never rise to the top because the weight of the universe is upon him. End quote. So he brings up another guy here, Humans. He talks about Spencer and Humans, and Humans is one of Spencer's popularizers. There are actually a lot of people that come up in this book. There are quite a few various social Darwinists. Spencer is just like one of the most famous, but Humans is another one. And he talks about how he was using some Spencerian ideas about leaving society alone to justify opposition to reform in various endeavors against labor agitating for an 8-hour workday. And I'm sure, like all ideas, it gets kind of twisted and put to a certain, someone might twist it in a certain way. I mean, that's not really like, if it really comes down to success, if labor is successful, then, it was meant to be successful and so on. It unfolds the way it unfolds. It's all a sort of power game. When entities enact their will, it's just, the cards will fall where they fall. If it's not the superior method, then it won't last. Now, you might say it's just delaying, but the eventual success of the successful. But I don't think it's possible to delay the success of the successful. Their success is only justified by being proven in reality. Nobody can properly predict what's going to be successful and either advance or restrain various forces in the world. And maybe the evolutionary progress puts the hands in the power of the state. It's I think hard to make a strong case against that possibility. If that becomes the most effective, successful means of organization, then so be it. So he jumps to another social Darwinist named William Graham Sumner, who has also written some pretty interesting stuff. I've read a little bit of his work. And he also brings up, I'll mention now, Malthus. Malthus was a guy before Darwin who talked about the population and how population grows at a faster rate than food production expands. Food production expands in an arithmetic method, and population expands in a multiplicative method. And there's always going to be faster population growth, and so there's always going to be some kind of conflict between people for limited resources. And maybe it's not going to be conflict, maybe it's going to be some sort of vice, some mechanism of causing failure to reproduce, and mechanism of causing starvation and mechanism of causing death that's going to act as a opposing force on account of and in conjunction with the limitations of food supply. I'd like to get to some Malthus in another episode, but for now I just want to give you that kind of overview there. So he says, quote, like Darwin before him, Sumner went to Malthus for the first principles of his system. In many respects, his sociology simply retraced the several steps in biological and social reasoning which ran from Malthus to Darwin, and through Spencer to the modern social Darwinists. The foundation of human society, said Sumner, is the man-land ratio. Ultimately, men drew their living from the soil, and the kind of existence they achieve, their mode of getting it, and their mutual relations in the process are all determined by the proportion of population to the available soil. Where men are few and soil is abundant, the struggle for existence is less savage and democratic institutions are likely to prevail. When population presses upon the land supply, earth hunger arises, races of men move across the face of the world, militarism and imperialism flourish, conflict rages, and in government aristocracy dominates. As men struggle to adjust themselves to the land, they enter into rivalry for leadership in the conquest of nature. In Sumner's popular essays, he stressed the idea that the hardships of life are incidents of the struggle against nature, that we cannot blame our fellow men for our share of these. My neighbor and I are both struggling to free ourselves from those ills. The fact that my neighbor has succeeded in this struggle better than I constitutes no grievance for me. He continued, undoubtedly the man who possesses capital has a great advantage over the man who has no capital at all in the struggle for existence. This does not mean that one man has an advantage against the other, but that, when they are rivals in the effort to get the means of subsistence from nature, the one who has capital has a measurable advantage over the other. If it were not so, capital would not be formed. Capital is only formed by self-denial, and if the possession of it did not secure advantages and superiorities of a high order, men would never submit to what is necessary to get it. Thus, the struggle is like a whippet race. The fact that one hound chases the mechanical hare of pecuniary success does not prevent others from doing the same. Sumner was perhaps inspired to minimize the human conflicts in the struggle for existence by a desire to dull the resentment of the poor toward the rich. He did not at all times, however, shrink from a direct analogy between animal struggle and human competition. In the Spencerian intellectual environment of the 1870s and 1880s, it was natural for conservatives to see the economic contest in competitive society as a reflection of the struggle in the animal world. It was easy to argue by analogy from natural selection of fitter organisms to social selection of fitter men, from organic forms with superior adaptability to citizens with a greater store of economic virtues. The competitive order was now supplied with a cosmic rationale. Competition was glorious. Just as survival was the result of strength, success was the reward of virtue. Sumner had no patience with those who would lavish compensations upon the virtueless. Many economists, he declared, in a lecture given in 1879 on the effect of hard times on economic thinking, seem to be distressed that distress and misery still remain on earth, and promise to remain as long as the vices of human nature remain. Many of them are frightened at liberty, especially under the form of competition which they elevate into a bugbear. They think it bears harshly on the weak. They do not perceive that here the strong and the weak are terms which admit of no definition, unless they are made equivalent to the industrious and the idle, the frugal and the extravagant. They do not perceive, furthermore, that if we do not like the survival of the fittest, we have only one possible alternative, and that is the survival of the unfittest. The former is the law of civilization, the latter is the law of anti-civilization. We have our choice between the two, or we can go on, as in the past, vacillating between the two, but a third plan, the socialist desideratum, a plan for nourishing the unfittest, and yet advancing in civilization, no man will ever find. The progress of civilization, according to Sumner, depends upon the selection process, and that, in turn, depends upon the workings of unrestricted competition. Competition is a law of nature, which can no more be done away with than gravitation, and which men can ignore only to their sorrow. End quote. So I like that section. That there's a couple of parts where the author is quoting a part of some of Sumner's writings, and he does that. He quotes from a couple of different social Darwinists. Sumner, I think, is a very good writer. I like the part here where he says, the competitive order was now supplied with a cosmic rationale. Competition was glorious. Just as survival was the result of strength, success was the reward of virtue. So he ties in virtue with success in life, with economic success, and he's talking about like a variety of different moral virtues leading to human success, and the same sort of factors of the animal world, where strength and cunning and speed and whatever it may be, health, camouflage, whatever, these qualities of the animals that make them more or less able to survive. He mentions strength, the author here, Hofstadter, and then Sumner had mentioned industriousness, and he had mentioned frugality. But as essentially virtues, human virtues operate in the same way, where they provide you with a various edge of your capacity to survive. And so there's something virtuous about success. There's something virtuous about survival. He says survival is glorious. Competition is glorious. Competitive order is supplied with a cosmic rationale. That I think that's true. Like, competition is a part of nature. It's a part of nature all the way from the single-celled organisms to human beings. Competition for limited resources and competition against one another for access to mates and access to everything, survival and potential resources and everything else. It's all this ongoing competition. The same sort of war of all against all is a part of nature, the competitive nature of life. And so it's not something that's to be scorned or to be separated from virtue. That virtue and competition are bound together now in this way, which is interesting. Discussing the idea of society as a superorganism, he says, quote, "One concept of the evolutionary philosophy, which Sumner borrowed from Spencer and employed with great effect in his fight against reformers, was social determinism. Society, the product of centuries of gradual evolution, cannot be quickly refashioned by legislation. The great stream of time and earthly things will sweep on just the same in spite of us. Every one of us is a child of his age and cannot get out of it. He is in the stream and is swept along with it. All his science and his philosophy come to him out of it. Therefore, the tide will not be changed by us. It will swallow up both of us and our experiments. That is why it is the greatest folly of which a man can be capable, to sit down with a slate and a pencil to plan out the new social world." To Sumner, as to Spencer, society was a superorganism, changing at a geologic tempo. For its emphasis upon slow change, Sumner eagerly welcomed the study of sociology. In his view, the social meddlers had been laboring under the delusion that since there are no natural laws of the social order, they might make the world over with artificial ones. But he expected that Spencer's new science would dissolve these fantasies. With the evolutionists' characteristic scorn for all forms of meliorism and voluntarism, Sumner dismissed Upton Sinclair and his fellow socialists as puny meddlers, social quacks, who would try to break into the age-old process of societal growth at an arbitrary point and remake it in accordance with their petty desires. They started from the premise that everybody ought to be happy, and assumed that therefore it should be possible to make everyone happy. They never asked, in what direction is society moving, or what are the mechanisms which motivate its progress? Evolution would teach them that it is impossible to tear down overnight a social system whose roots are centuries deep in the soil of history. History would teach them that revolutions never succeed. Witness the experience of France, where the Napoleonic period left essential interests much as they had been before 1789. end quote. So here we get the idea of society as a slow-moving organism that has causes. It says, what direction is society moving? What are the mechanisms which motivate its progress? It has mechanisms, it has means, and it operates at an incredibly slow tempo. And people who want to sit down with a slate and pencil to plan out a new social world, when he's quoting from Sumner, Sumner says that's the greatest folly of man, to think that you can sit down and plan it all out. He says, Sumner had said, I'm going to reread the section where he's reading Sumner. Sumner says, the great stream of time and earthly things will sweep on, just the same in spite of us. He says, every one of us is a child of his age, cannot get out of it. He is in the stream and swept along with it. All his science and philosophy come to him out of it. Therefore, the tide will not be changed by us. It will swallow up both of us and our experiments. That is why it is the greatest folly of which a man can be capable, to sit down with a slate and pencil to plan out a new social world. We are subject to the stream of time. We're products of our age. We're products of our ancestors. We're a combination of those things. We are carrying on everything that has come before, and yet we are here now, and we are altered by our presence in the present. And he says these socialists started from the premise that everybody ought to be happy, and assumed that therefore it should be possible to make everyone happy. That's the unconstrained vision. But Sumner believes in the constrained vision. There is a way of human nature. We're not blank slates. There's a certain way that we are individually, and there's a certain way that we are socially, and there's a certain way that we are by our tribes and clans, as the rule of the clan pointed out. There's a natural division of people into groups at the family level and expanding from there, that operate in a way, although not completely, operate as organisms of their own with their own mechanisms. And these groups engage in their own sort of evolution. And it's in these competing groups that social evolution and cultural evolution are able to happen at such a rapid rate. And so the shape of the group changes rapidly, more rapidly than the genetic structures of individual human beings. And of course, we'll be getting more into that sort of group evolution in future episodes. Right here, I want to read where he talks about how conservative Christians responded to this Darwinian secular conservatism. He says, quote, Francis Bowen, professor of moral philosophy at Harvard, who could never overcome his religious hostility to Darwin, probably expressed the attitude of many old-school Christian conservatives when he attempted to discredit Darwinism by accentuating its dire social consequences. Familiar with the Malthusian genealogy of natural selection, Bowen linked the two as twin errors. Malthusianism had become popular in England, he pointed out, because it had counteracted the revolutionary ideas of men like Godwin. But it had also been used to relieve the rich of responsibility for the sufferings of the poor. Malthus had been proved wrong by the course of events, and just when his theory was dying out in political economy, it received fresh support from Darwinian biology. The same arguments against the theory still hold good, for the social process is the opposite of the Darwinian process. It is undeniable that the lower classes are more fertile than the upper, that the unfittest rather than the fittest survive. Thus it is the existence of higher, not lower forms that is imperiled in the social process. The solution to this can only come from persons of wealth, culture, and refinement, who must violate the canons of Malthus and propagate more freely to promote civilization. Wherever the Darwin-Malthus system is applied, its consequences are bad. In sociology, a hard-hearted indifference to the sufferings of the poor. In religion, atheism. In philosophy, the dark wastes of German pessimism, and a contempt for the value of human life, which, like Stoicism in Rome, presages social catastrophe. Comparable in its social conservatism, but more congenial to the scientific spirit, was the view of another writer who predicted a great conflict between what he termed the sympathetic and the scientific theories of government. The sympathetic party is all for alleviating the condition of the working class by social legislation. No such philanthropic softness is really needed in the United States, where only natural incapacity prevents a man from becoming a capitalist. The masses cannot be artificially saved from their own incompetence without social disaster. American society, under the influence of the philanthropists of the sympathetic party, is being deluged by a flood of immigrants and dragged down by an increasing proportion of incapables. The scientific party would defend the principle of competition, conformity to the law of supply and demand, and a fair field for the experiment of the survival of the fittest. End quote. So there's a couple, he talks about two people, Francis Bowen, and then he talks about another person who he oddly doesn't name, but I can tell you from the notes. Hardaker. But oddly, he didn't name him in the body here, but he also talks about Francis Bowen, professor of moral philosophy at Harvard. And he's basically saying, oddly, that he says the social process is the opposite of the Darwinian process, according to this Francis Bowen. He says it's undeniable the lower classes are more fertile than the upper, and that the unfittest rather than the fittest survive in the social setting. Thus, it's the existence of higher and not lower forms that are imperiled by society. The solution can only come from persons of wealth, culture, and refinement who must propagate more freely to promote civilization. That doesn't make any sense. Totally ignores the premise of limited resources. And it just relies on some sort of endless expansion. I don't see the conservatism in endless expansion, but or ignoring circumstances. And this other person, Hardaker, talks about the sympathetic and scientific theories of government. The sympathetic is constantly trying to alleviate the condition of the working class, and yet unrestrained, the sympathetic party, American society under the influence of the philanthropists of the sympathetic party, the constant givers, the philanthropists, it is being deluged by a flood of immigrants and dragged down by an increasing proportion of incapables. Whereas the scientific party would make America a fair field for the experiment of the survival of the fittest. And then one more individual that he talks about is John Fiske, where he says, quote, "Within each nation, the most appealing character, usually the best, prevails, and in the now dominant western part of the world, these competitions between nations and character types have been intensified by intrinsic forces. Of the existence of progress in the military art, there can be no doubt, nor of its corollary that the most advanced will destroy the weaker, that the more compact will eliminate the scattered, and that the more civilized are the more compact. An advance in civilization is thus a military advantage. Backward civilizations, being more rigid in the structure of their law and custom, kill out varieties at birth, but progress depends upon the emergence of varieties. Progress is only possible in those happy cases where the force of legality has gone far enough to bind the nation together, but not far enough to kill out all varieties and to destroy nature's perpetual tendency to change. Early societies were in a grave dilemma. They needed custom to survive. But unless it was sufficiently flexible to admit variations, they were frozen in their ancient mold. Modern societies, living in an age of discussion rather than rigid custom, have found a means of reconciling order with progress. Darwin's task of finding natural roots for man's moral feelings and for the sympathy that underlies persistent social cooperation was taken up by John Fiske in his Outlines of Cosmic Philosophy, 1874, and The Meaning of Infancy, 1883. After reading Alfred Wallace's account of his observations in the Malay archipelago, Fiske had been struck by the thought that one thing that distinguishes the human race from the other mammals is the very long duration of its infancy. In general, there is a correlation between the complexity of a species' potential behavior and the proportion of its behavior that is acquired by learning after birth. The human infant acquires the smallest proportion of its ultimate capacities during gestation. It is born less developed than the young of other species, and must undergo a long plastic period in which it learns the ways of its race. What makes the human species progressive, Fiske reasoned, is the fact that the infant does not come into the world with its capacities all cut and dried, but on the contrary must learn slowly and is therefore able to learn an infinitely wider range of behavior. The necessity of seeing infants through this long period prolongs the years of maternal affection and care and tends to keep father, mother, and child together. In short, to found the stable family, and ultimately the clan organization, the first step toward civil society. From being merely gregarious, man becomes social. Once the clan is organized, natural selection intervenes to maintain it, for those clans in which the primeval selfish instincts were most effectively subordinated to the needs of the group would prevail in the struggle for life. In this way, the first germs of altruism and morality, manifest in the mother's care of the infant, become generalized into wider and wider social bonds until they form sympathies broad enough to support the communal life of civilized man as he is now known. The moral sense has its foundation in the primitive biological unit, the family, and the social cooperation and solidarity of men is nothing if not natural. Fiske's philosophy attempted to give to the higher ethical impulses a direct root in the evolutionary process. End quote. So I really like that section. This guy, John Fiske, sounds like a pretty cool thinker. He's talking about some really primeval stuff in his books, Outlines of Cosmic Philosophy and the Meaning of Infancy. I would like to get those and read them. He talks about the long, extended infancy, extended childhood. An animal comes out and can walk in like a couple hours at the most. It's out jumping around, figuring out what to do, and by the time an animal is a year old, it's basically got it all down. A human at a year old is only just beginning to learn all the various things that he or she will learn through the course of his or her life. So that variability and capacity to learn so many different things, rather than just have one set of things one learns in gestation that's going to be the same for every person. The varieties of things that one will learn with that extended learning period outside of the womb, invariably one is going to learn different things, and the more different things one's capable of learning, the more adaptable one becomes. And that's probably a major part of human success, but it's also a part of the human society, because these young children wind up demanding longer and longer periods of mother's time. Mother requires the protection and support of father for a longer period of time, and the family unit is born. And the family unit just naturally extends to the clan. The brothers and the sisters form their family bonds, and that is the basic fundamental unit of civil society. So that's all real interesting. And some of that stuff sounds very modern. And he talks a little bit about the competition of group against group. Groups that are able to bond together well will be more successful. And as I said, that's actually a contested idea, the fact or fiction of group evolution, whether or not tribes are competing with other tribes in ways that the tribes evolve or the process of evolution occurs. Given that the actual evolutionary unit of selection is the gene, and the genes only exist inside the individuals, the individual who benefits himself, who backstabs, so to speak, if you use the terminology I was using last episode about the prisoner's dilemma, betrays, does not cooperate with the group, and exploits the group's tendency toward altruism, but doesn't reciprocate in altruism and only acquires for himself a free rider, if you will. The free rider problem always dismantles the group's capacity for cohesion, unless there are other things involved. And we looked at this in a couple of past books about how the altruistic behavior is enforced in order to, through non-cooperation with, if units in the endless prisoners dilemma games don't cooperate, then the other units in the ongoing prisoners dilemma simulation don't cooperate with that one because he's not a cooperator. Moral norms are enforced, cooperative norms are enforced. Other units, knowing that they will be punished by not cooperating in ways that are more powerful and more influencing than whatever benefit could be gained by being a free rider, the enforced social norms prevent the free riders. And that's the only way that the systems can... so that's the big question. Can individuals, can groups evolve as long as individuals, the individual genes, benefit more by confounding the evolution of the group in their own favor? An ongoing discussion, an ongoing question in evolutionary theory, and I do have some books that discuss that I want to get to. But for now, let's jump to the next section where he brings William James into the mix. He says, quote, William James was the first great beneficiary of the scientific education emerging in the United States during the 1860s and 1870s. Trained at Harvard Lawrence Scientific School by Eliot, Wyman, and Agassiz, James was distinguished from most of his contemporaries by an understanding of scientific method, coupled with a broad streak of mysticism and acute moral and aesthetic sensitivity. This may be traced in part to the influence of his father, the elder Henry James, who was a Swedenborgian. Personal factors, emotion, and temperament loom unusually large in the formation of James's thought. In 1869 to 70, he underwent a severe emotional depression, in which he almost lost his will to live. From it, he emerged with a highly intellectualized solution, a passionate belief in freedom of the will. The revolt against the monistic superstition under which I had grown up, a dominant motif in his thought, led him into rebellion against all block universe philosophies, all systems which were finished and executed, impervious to chance or choice. Primarily, his revolt against the prevailing philosophies, Spencerianism and Hegelianism, was a revolt against the moral and aesthetic bleakness of hide-bound philosophical systems. This was the source of the pluralism he preached. It surely is a merit in a philosophy to make the very life we lead real and earnest, he wrote. Pluralism, in exercising the absolute, exercises the great derealizer of the only life we are at home in, and thus redeems the nature of reality from essential foreignness. James's thought is usually looked upon as a reaction from the absolute idealism expounded by his Harvard colleague Josiah Royce, and in the writings of his later years, this reaction is particularly clear. But the basic trend of his thinking, which was well established before he became acquainted with Royce, was visible in his work at the same time that the St. Louis Hegelians were beginning to spread their creed. James's original impulse was in a large measure also a reaction from Herbert Spencer. The years when Spencer's philosophy was winning attention were the formative years of James's intellectual life. He read first principles in the early 1860s and soon enrolled in the ranks of Spencerian converts. So infatuated was he with the intellectual revolution which Spencer had apparently accomplished that he felt spiritually wounded when Charles Peirce attacked the master in his presence. Yet Peirce's arguments prevailed. James soon began to criticize Spencer himself, and by the middle 1870s he was roundly contemptuous of Spencer's ponderous system. Although he was using the principles of psychology in his teaching at Harvard, he urged his students to criticize Spencer's reasoning, and for almost 3 decades he offered courses in which the Englishman served as a whipping boy. While he considered First Principles a museum of logical confusions, the emotional core of his reaction to Spencer is suggested by James's complaint that Spencer's mind was so fatally lacking in geniality, humor, picturesqueness, and poetry, and so explicit, so mechanical, so flat in the panorama which it gives to life. James was overcome by the awfully monotonous quality in Spencer, remarking that one finds no twilight region in his mind, and no capacity for dreaminess and passivity. All parts of it are filled with the same noonday glare, like a dry desert, where every grain of sand shows singly, and there are no mysteries or shadows. In his pragmatism, he paused to object to Spencer's dry schoolmaster temperament, his preference for cheap makeshifts in arguments, his lack of education even in mechanical principles, and in general the vagueness of all his fundamental ideas, his whole system wooden, as if knocked together out of cracked hemlock boards. The margins of James's copy of First Principles he decorated with such remarks as absurd, trebly asinine, curse his metaphysics, and damned scholastic quibble. He made fun of the vacuity of Spencer's fundamental principles, declaring Spencer's use of the persistence of force to be vagueness incarnate, and suggesting ridiculous examples for his principle of the rhythm of motion, such as people going upstairs and downstairs, intermittent fevers, and cradles and rocking chairs. Spencer's definition of evolution he parodied in his lectures in these terms: evolution is a change from a no-howish, untalkaboutable all-alikeness to a somehowish and in general talkaboutable not all-alikeness by continuous stick-togetherations and something-elsifications. End quote. So that odd section at the end there is James basically mocking Spencer, a sort of a satire of something Spencer would say. So this is, I think, real interesting to me because it gets right to something really important about William James. He says William James in 1869 to 70 underwent a severe emotional depression in which he almost lost his will to live. He did go through this serious period. This is early in his life, 1869 to 70. William James, born in 1842. So you're looking at like 27, 28 years old. Fairly young in his life. Severe emotional depression. And when he emerged, he says he emerged with a highly intellectualized solution, a passionate belief in freedom of the will. Well, famous William James idea is that in the midst of this depression, his first act of free will was to declare the existence of free will, to declare his own free will. So interesting that free will was such an important part of this dilemma that he faced. I think that he must have felt something like an encroaching determinism. The lack of free will seems like it may have been the problem. He was wrestling with this. Maybe he was wrestling with, is there free will? Is there not free will? Is there free will? Is that, oddly, it seems like this was a major issue for him. We saw in some of his writings, he wrote the essay, The Dilemma of Determinism. And he wrote the essay, The Will to Believe, Free Will and Determinism, and arguing against determinism and arguing in favor of free will are something that are oddly important to him. But if you look at his writings, and we looked at the psychology course, the briefer course of Principles of Psychology, he's talking a lot about the brain and instincts, and I feel like the more he's studying, he's like learning about the way the mind works, and this is something that he just constantly, his whole life, was wrestling with. For 30 years, he says he taught classes where Herbert Spencer was the whipping boy. The whole class, he would lead arguments against Spencer's ideas, would encourage his class to criticize the books by Spencer he was using as his textbooks, and just tried to go in a totally different direction. And free will and opposition to determinism were at the core of his own particular direction. So I think that's real interesting, just how much of William James was an argument against the determinism that was continually popping up in all of his life's examinations of psychology and the human mind. And yet he couldn't let go of free will. It became incredibly important to him that he affirm it. And I think it's interesting because he is like the leading psychologist at Harvard. He's written Principles of Psychology, which is the leading psychology textbook. He's essentially in the 1880s and 1890s, William James is the leading psychologist in America. And I think he felt a profound duty to get it right on this question. And I don't think he was comfortable telling America that, that we're deterministic beings. But long before he became a psychologist, like I said, he wrestled with this all the way back in his late 20s. And so I think that that's important to kind of point out how much that was a factor in his writing and in his thought. And I'm more of a determinist, and I've wondered, with everything that William James was learning about the human mind, consistently pointing at determinism in how we act, in our instincts, in our behavior, not just the ideas of causality and chemistry and stuff, but actual human behavior and actual human thought patterns driven by mechanical processes in the brain. It makes me wonder, what would a pragmatism look like that was more open to determinism? To what extent does William James's focus on free will, like, how fundamental is that to pragmatism? Is that the critical element, or is that something that could potentially be set aside with another examination, another pragmatic approach that maybe understands free will as an illusion? Is that possible? Now, pragmatism being a philosophy of action, one might say that it depends on free will. But it's certainly a question worth asking, and something that I'm continually asking as I look at these books that discuss William James and pragmatism and discuss determinism and free will. So one last section here, talking more about William James. He says, quote, "In 1878, the Journal of Speculative Philosophy published an article by James entitled Remarks on Spencer's Definition of Mind as Correspondence, in which the lines of his later thought are clearly foreshadowed. The article shows also how much more dynamic than Spencer's was James's understanding of the implications of Darwinism for psychology. Spencer, in defining the mind in terms of adjustment, leaves out the greater part of what is usually considered the mental life. Spencer defines life as the adjustment of inner to outer relations, and looks upon mind and cognition as aspects of that adjustment. He forgets, according to James, all non-cognitive elements in mind, all sentiment and emotion. He plays down or ignores entirely the element of interest in the organism, which is essential to the whole process of cognition. He defines intelligent mental reactions as those that minister to survival by arranging internal relations to suit the environment. But the critical factor in the cognitive situation, the desire for survival or welfare, is a subjective element, which he leaves out. The idea of correspondence between inner and outer relations, to be made meaningful as the criterion of mental acts, must be qualified by some subjective or teleological reference. Furthermore, the idea that mind ministers to survival alone cannot explain the full range of higher cultural activities which have no survival value. The knower, James concluded, is not simply a mirror floating with no foothold anywhere, and passively reflecting an order that he comes upon and finds simply existing. The knower is an actor, and coefficient of the truth on one side, whilst on the other he registers the truth which he helps to create. Mental interests, hypotheses, postulates, so far as they are bases for human action, actions which to a great extent transforms the world, must help to make the truth which they declare. In other words, there belongs to mind, from its birth upward, a spontaneity, a vote. It is in the game, and not a mere looker-on, and its judgments of the should-be, its ideals, cannot be peeled off from the body of the cogitandum, as if they were excrescences, or meant, at most, survival. In his Principles of Psychology, which appeared in 1890, James continued this line of thought. There he made a sharp break with the traditional view of mind as a quiet cognitive organ, and criticized post-Darwinian psychology for its neglect of the active role of the mind. It had become habitual, he complained, to speak as if the mere body that owns the brain has interests, to treat the body's survival as an absolute end without reference to any commanding intelligence. In this bare physical view, the reactions of an organism cannot be considered useful or harmful. It can only be said of them that if they occur in certain ways, survival will incidentally be their consequence. But the moment you bring a consciousness into the midst, survival ceases to be a mere hypothesis. No longer is it, if survival is to occur, then so-and-so brain and other organs work. It has now become an imperative decree. Survival shall occur, and therefore organs must so work. Real ends appear for the first time upon the world stage. Every actually existing consciousness seems to itself, at any rate, to be a fighter for ends, of which many, but for its presence, would not be ends at all. Its powers of cognition are mainly subservient to these ends, discerning which facts further them and which do not. The doctrine, or method, of pragmatism, taken with acknowledgment from Peirce, was a projection of this approach to the test of knowledge, a world in which theories are experimental instruments rather than answers, and in which truth happens to an idea, can be made by the knower, was alone coherent with the unfinished universe James chose to believe in. In 1880, James made one of his rare ventures into social theory when he published in the Atlantic Monthly an article on great men, great thoughts, and the environment. Using Spencer and his disciples as a foil, James raised the question, what causes communities to change from generation to generation? With Walter Bagehot, whose physics and politics he greatly admired, James believed the changes were the result of innovations by unusual or outstanding individuals, playing the same role in social change as variations in Darwin's theory of evolution. Such persons are selected by society and elevated into positions of influence because of their adaptability to the social situation into which they happen to be born. The Spencerians had attributed social changes to geography, environment, external circumstances, in brief, to everything except human control. They had assumed the existence of a universal web of causation, in which the finite human intellect becomes hopelessly entangled. Spencer, in his study of sociology, attributed everything to prior conditions, a process which, when pushed further and further back, becomes circular and yields nothing of value in social analysis. It offers nothing but the omnipotence of circumstances. In much the same way as the Oriental answers every question with, God is great. This evolutionary philosophy has no explanation for the patent fact that great men change the course of social development. The significant details of their careers cannot be predicted by or attributed to the vague complex of factors, which, in the Spencerian philosophy, is invoked by the term environment. There was no convergence of sociological pressures, which demanded that William Shakespeare be born at Stratford-on-Avon in 1564. The most that sociology can predict is that if a great man of such nature appears, under certain circumstances, he will affect society in such and such a way, but that he does affect it should not be denied. The great man is himself part of the environment of everybody else. End quote. So there's some interesting stuff in here where he talks about, he's written this article in criticism of Spencer back in 1880, which was pretty far back, actually, that one. And the other one that I mentioned in 1878, those are some of his earliest works. 1878, actually, before the Sentiment of Rationality, which I read previously, which was a really good one. So these are some of his early writings. But he's talking about how Spencer just says everything that happens in a society is the result of this factor, that factor, the other factor. And William James says, okay, what about great men? Great men arise and influence society in a certain way. And Spencer can't predict any of this, and he doesn't attribute any of this to the will of any person or people. The decisions of any people, everything is just happens to people. Spencer is the determinist, and he's criticizing the determinist in this way. But what's interesting is that there are multiple levels of where things are happening, and the actual determinism is happening at such a granular level. The determinism is happening at the chemical level, and the atomic level, and the subatomic level. The determinism is happening at a low level, and everything unfolds from that. And so while Spencer can't predict the birth of a great man, mechanical features of all of the underlying layer unfold into the genetic processes, the environmental processes, and so on and so forth. All of the complex moving parts are born out of chemical, physical processes that are themselves completely deterministic. It's just that, as I've said before, it's at such a granular, fine level, and it's so complex and it's so complete in every, iota of space in the entire universe that it becomes, there's always an unpredictable element to it. But it's only unpredictable by us. It's not unpredictable, by a potential mind, just out of our grasp. And that's the difference. Neither of these men understood genetics. There was no genetics back then. So, the idea that there is some sort of factor that produces the birth of a great man. None of the factors that were described by Spencer could pinpoint and predict the actions or the birth or the life of a great person, a great individual, or any other individual in their individuality and in their own particular capabilities, because that's at the genetic level. That's not at the level that Spencer was operating on. So that's all that I'm going to read from this book. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time. Goodbye.